Hello and welcome to As We May Think. If you find yourself adding a few packages to your JavaScript app that you're building, odds are that you're either going to add Lodash yourself within the first few packages, or something you add is going to add it. And the reason why is because Lodash is depended upon by 98,000 other packages. It is the most depended upon thing. A lot of people would tell you it's absolutely essential. And if not Lodash, then perhaps underscore, which was an earlier version of the same kind of utility library. Both provided a whole lot of functions for you to be able to manipulate arrays, deal with collections, find and map and change and filter data, do all kinds of things like that. The thing is, you don't need them nearly as much anymore. You can get by without them because in the last few years, ES5 and ES6 and ES7 and ES8 have all added all kinds of little functions to array and map. They've added iterators and generators and all sorts of things to provide some of those same kinds of functionality directly to what you have available to you. For example, for each is part of an array, as is find and filter and map and reduce. All these are readily available these days, even ones that are maybe a little more esoteric like sum or every. Those are available to you to use directly within the language itself in the browser. You don't need some other library to provide it for you. And if you're using IE11, well, God help you, but if you're using IE11, you even have an option of saying, okay, well, it doesn't necessarily have all of these. Some of them are not provided. I'm pretty sure if I look at, for example, sum or every, I'm betting one of those is not available on IE11. Let's see. Let's see if John's right on that. Nope, wrong there. But trust me, there are some that are not available. And if that's the case, fine. What you can do is you can go get a piece of software called core.js. The person who works on that works very hard, and throw him a few bucks or see if you can find him a job, because I know he's been looking for one. But anyway, it's an excellent library that tries to polyfill, that is, put in all of these functions that are available on later browsers in IE11. So you could use them in your app, and then just for IE11 users, make sure that core.js is loaded. And know that for the map or reduce or whatever it is you're using, it's going to be readily available to all your browsers. That has spawned a couple of different things. There are not libraries, but there are sites out there now that say you might not need Lodash. Some of them are were even more aggressive at one point and said you don't need Lodash and underscore. They've kind of, you'll notice, put a little proviso on that now. In either case, they give you the idea that you can say, okay, I'm going to search for some particular function that I might need, like, I don't know, sum. And then if you do a search for it, then it shows you how that works in Lodash, and then how the same thing would work with what's provided by the browser. In some cases, it's obviously it's built right in. You don't need to worry about that. In other cases, there's actually a translation between the two. So you can see, here's difference, for example. And they show, oh, well, you can use includes to do the same thing. Or here's difference by, and here's how you might perform that same kind of action using what's available in your browser. Great. But today, while I'm going to say, yes, pay attention to this. You don't keep using Lodash and underscore. Underscore, if you're not familiar with it, is just an older version of the same thing. I think it actually predates Lodash. It, too, was a library that used an underscore and a dot for all of its functions. It was the same kind of function library, and then Lodash came along later and has become more popular. As you can see from this, underscore is still much used. There's 20,000 different packages that depend upon it. It just doesn't come close to Lodash. It's certainly not in the top 10, I don't think. I was surprised to see that Lodash was... I actually wasn't surprised that Lodash was number one, but I was surprised that things like React and Express were so far down the list in comparison. So anyway, do pay attention to the you might not need lists. They will help you in those cases where you don't already know that filter or find or whatever is going to solve your problem. Sometimes they can help you fill in the difference. But there are still occasions where you need Lodash. And I'm going to talk about one of them right now. If you've ever built an app where you took user input, then users can have a bad tendency to kind of hammer things sometimes. They can hit a button a whole lot of times, and they can lead to too much input. So let's do PM run storybook. And I've set up an example of a simple control that is mounted directly to trigger a... Okay, here we go. As I hit this, every single time I hit it, you immediately get a little flash from this red banner that shows up. You can imagine that that is something that causes a search to be performed, or you can imagine that it triggers a filter, or you can imagine that it goes off and makes an API call to the back end. In any of those cases, it may be fine if they just hammer it as much as they want to. If they just put their focus on that and start hitting the space bar as many times as they want. But there's a good chance in some kinds of apps that you don't want that. A classic example is where your input control is simply a text field, and as a user types, you're performing a search. Do you want every single keystroke to result in a new search? Or do you want to let them finish typing whatever it is they're typing and then trigger the search or the filter or whatever? This is a case where debounce is really useful. If you're not familiar with the term debounce, it dates back a long ways. I looked it up because I was curious. And keyboards and switches of all types have needed debounce for a long time. And that's because when you close an electromechanical switch, it's really common to have spurious signals as it first makes contact. It's not uncommon for it to say, I made contact. I did make contact. I did. And just for a second there, flip up and down and up and down and up and down. When in fact, the user was just trying to push it down and then release it. So key debounce circuitry was put into keyboards and things like that so that I could type a key and it only thought I pressed the key once and then I released. And then if I do literally hit the key repeatedly, the key debounce doesn't kick in for those kinds of things. We're really slow. Key debounce is very, very quick. But the analogy, you should be able to see the analogy between the two. Here we're saying, I don't want to take the first action you take. I want to take maybe the 10th action you take. I want you to be able to start typing, and if you hit another key, I'm going to wait a little bit longer, and then I'm going to wait a little bit longer if you hit another key, and so forth. And only once you've stopped with all of your typing and backspacing and typing, am I going to then take the final result and then perform the action. Very similar to that is the idea of throttling. If I don't want, maybe I don't want to wait until every time you hit this thing. Maybe I'm okay with it doing some of these calls, but I want to dial it way down. If you hit it 100 times in 10 seconds, that's not okay with me. But I am okay with, if you hit it 100 times in 10 seconds, I will make the call once a second for those 10 seconds. So I'll make 10 calls even though you hit it 100 times. That's throttling, and so it's different than debouncing. Debouncing is all about waiting until it looks like you're finally done with something and pausing until that moment occurs, and only then performing the API call. So are doing the action, whatever it is. So let's look at how those two might be used. So bringing this back around to the idea of Lodash, not surprisingly, Lodash provides us with functions called debounce and throttle. I'm going to make this full screen so it's a little easier to see, and then we'll go back to the code when the time comes. We'll go back to the UI when the time comes. So this is a very simple web component that I've built. It's the one you saw a moment ago. You click the button, here's the button here, the event occurs, and that calls this right here, which simply throws a flag to true. That causes that section to appear in bright red, and then it says, I'm going to start a timer, and then after 500 milliseconds, I'm going to turn it back to false, so it disappears again. That's all it does. It's very simple. But I want this to now start having either debounce on it or throttling, because we're going to demonstrate both of those too. So the first thing I need is I actually need the functions debounce and throttle. So we're going to import those from Lodash. Alright, so now we've got the two functions. And by doing it this way, theoretically we aren't pulling the whole Lodash library in, especially if you pick the Lodash ES. Some people have said that if you pick the Lodash ES package, it's better about what's called tree shaking. If you haven't heard that term before, it's where things like Webpack and Rollup and whatnot can look at a library and say, well, you only use these two functions out of it. I'm going to try and get those two functions and any functions they used out. But all the other stuff that you didn't use, which might be hundreds of K, depending on what the library is, I'm going to try and ignore that and leave it behind and hopefully just get what the bare minimum you need into your app. So we're doing this import, and what we need is two other versions of button clicked. So in the case of both debounce and throttle, what they do is they create other functions. So we're going to say this dot, we're going to do debounced button clicked equals debounce, and so it's going to be this dot button clicked. So basically we are taking our existing function, and what debounce is going to do is return us an all new function that wraps that. So that is going to, we'll say the user must wait at least 300 milliseconds. After the last key that they type, we're going to wait 300 well, this is a button though. Let's not do it. I'm a little slower to click, so we'll make it 500 milliseconds. So after the last time I clicked, 500 milliseconds will elapse, and then it will actually perform the action. And there are options here. In this case, I'm going to say trailing true. So this basically says it's going to wait 500 milliseconds and then do it. There are other options where you can say it happens on the leading edge, the trailing edge, it happens on both edges. There's all kinds of stuff. But in this case, I'm basically, what's going to happen here is I click the button. If I click it again within 500 milliseconds, that restarts the timer. So then it's going to wait 500 more milliseconds. If I click again in there, it'll start it over again, so forth, any number of times. And then finally, when I've paused for 500 complete milliseconds without clicking it, then it says, now it's time to do the action. And now we're going to do the same thing with throttle. And we'll say every 1,000 milliseconds. So once a second. No more often than that, we're going to allow this to happen. All right, so how do we use these two new functions that we created? Both are going to turn around and call this when they are done. Let's just substitute them. So what happens if we come in here and we say debounced button clicked. So if I do this and save it, you'll notice Storybook rebuilt, and we come back over here, and now what should happen is if I hammer this, I clicked it over and over and over again rapidly, and only the last one really triggered the event. Well, actually, that's not really true. The pause after the last one finally triggered the event. So if I clicked it just once, it would trigger. If I clicked it any number of times rapidly, that would also trigger it just once. This is perfect for those circumstances where you're trying to type text into a field. You might say 300 milliseconds. That's a pretty common number. Somebody can type in rapidly into the field if they want to, hit backspace multiple times and whatnot. And at the moment they pause, within 300 milliseconds, that's a pretty short time. That's less than a third of a second. Then it will actually trigger the action. I recommend that. It works really, really well, and it results in a good user experience if you're calling an API or you're performing front-end filtering. Front-end filtering is actually something that the next couple of videos I'm going to be doing are all about. One is about text search, and the other one is going to be about a library that helps with other kinds of front-end filtering that I've used in the past, and I like it a lot. So now let's swap this out, and we're going to do a throttled version of this same thing. Now, let's hammer it again. So the difference in this case is, as you saw, I can really, really hammer it, and it basically says, once you've started doing that, I'm going to ignore most of those clicks, but I am going to still execute it once a second, because that's how often you said it was all right for me to restart the timer. So any number of clicks within 1 second results in one call, and then the timer starts over again, and any number of clicks in the next second also results in one call. Again, same kind of options are available to you as to when it triggers it, upon seeing the first click, upon seeing a later click, whatever it's trying to do. You've got lots of options there. So don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. Lodash still has great functionality in it. Debounce and throttle, you'll notice, if you do a search in this, I think it will tell us. Yep. You'll notice that there is no attempt to say, oh, you don't need that anymore. Ditto if I were to do the same thing with debounce, there's no fix for those. So Lodash still has useful stuff in it. But for a lot of things that you might be using it for, map, reduce, filter, find, don't use it anymore. Just use what's built into the browser, built into JavaScript itself. And if you find yourself needing something a little more esoteric, but still can be based upon map or reduce or whatever, drop right, for example, I would have to come here and I'd quickly look up exactly how one does drop right. So thank you so much for your time. I hope you enjoy using Lodash. I hope you enjoy using Lodash a little bit more with this knowledge of how it can help your UI. Thank you so much for listening again to As We May Think. I appreciate your viewership every single time, and if you enjoyed it, please click like and subscribe, as well as the notify bell that you see on your screen. That'll let you know whenever a new episode drops, which is normally Tuesdays and Thursdays. Again, thank you so much. Bye-bye.